Tukma, Sohochifowat, Carrie Chu, Chakasha Saya, Chakasha Numpa, Shalili. Greetings, my name is Carrie Chu. I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and I'm a Chickasaw language learner. Thank you for attending my talk, Learning and Teaching in Relation, Using Technology to Support Indigenous Language Education. In an Indigenous paradigm, knowledge is locally situated, held within languages, and inherently relational. Enduring legacies of colonization, including English-only schooling, separation of families, and the taking of land have threatened natural processes of intergenerational knowledge sharing and the continuance of Indigenous languages. Gathering in person to eat, be on the land, and connect with others are ideal ways to share languages. However, for communities that are displaced from their territories, have large diasporic and urban populations, have few to no remaining speakers, and/or have been impacted by the pandemic, in-person activities are not always possible. Are you able to hear me? I see in the chat there's a message. Let me just make sure that tech is working. You can hear? Okay, great. All right, wonderful. Okay, so in these cases, communities may turn to technology to create online spaces for language sharing. Further, communities working in person may choose to use technology to support current initiatives. Emerging from my experiences co-developing Rosetta Stone Chickasaw with my community, the work I will share considers how Indigenous peoples center relationality and engage in decolonizing praxis when using technology to support Indigenous language education. Today, I will discuss online Indigenous language courses and relationality, my positionality, my community, and my work on Rosetta Stone Chickasaw, examples from a guidebook about the use of video, audio, images, and more to teach and learn language using technology, and also ideas for using technology in Indigenous language education spaces to support language revitalization and affirm sovereignty. So while the research I'm discussing focused specifically on online Indigenous language courses, I will share ways that the lessons learned can be applied more broadly to the use of technology in Indigenous language education spaces, whether you're working in person or online. So I'll start by just giving you a bit of an overview about online Indigenous language courses. So these are a type of computer-assisted language learning, also called CALL for short. Indigenous nations and organizations typically create online courses for their languages in partnership with language education technology providers like the ones you see here, 7,000 Languages, Duolingo, Rosetta Stone, etc. And there are over 100 online Indigenous language courses currently available across these platforms. And later I'll share a map where you can browse some of these. So while there are many courses, information about how CALL can support Indigenous language revitalization and reclamation is relatively limited. Research about CALL has mostly focused on how this technology is used for learning and teaching dominant languages like English, French, or Spanish. And Indigenous language revitalization and reclamation has mostly focused on in-person teaching and learning strategies, although this has shifted a little bit with the pandemic because all of a sudden everyone had to move online. So the question that I ask is, how do Indigenous peoples enact relationality in online Indigenous language courses? So I'll start with what I mean by relationality. And I'm going to draw on some of the work of other scholars. So relationality is the heart of Indigenous ways of knowing. In other words, relationships between people, land, plants, animals, spirits, and languages do not merely shape reality, they are reality. And for this reason, Indigenous language reclamation is not just about learning and teaching languages effectively, but also retaining the worldview and understandings within the language. This can also be thought of as the spirit of the language. And you might notice that I'm using the term reclamation, and this is intentional. So Miami scholar Wesley Leonard distinguishes between language reclamation and language revitalization. So language revitalization focuses on increasing the number of speakers of a language and the domains or the places where the language is used. Language reclamation encompasses language revitalization, but it also goes a step further to describe a process of decolonization that reclaims the appropriate cultural context and sense of value that the language would have always had if not for colonization. For this reason, language reclamation is decolonizing praxis. Maori scholar Graham Smith describes decolonizing and transformative praxis as moving beyond mere descriptions of problems and issues toward making sure that change does in fact occur. Indigenous language advocates have been engaging in online learning and teaching as a site of change. Online courses can create new opportunities to build and strengthen relationships. And at the same time, there's challenges to enacting relationality as place, relationships, and community building all become virtual constructs. And this is something that we're experiencing right now as we connect over a webinar virtually. So this map here shows part of North America without colonial borders. And the labels that you see are some, but definitely not all Indigenous languages. And I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but I'm calling in from Oklahoma in the Chickasaw Nation here. And actually, I would invite you, if you'd like, in the chat to take a moment and shout out where you're calling in from. And also, if you'd like, what language you speak. Orienting ourselves to place through language is important because Indigenous languages are embodied languages and grow out of the lands, seas, and skies. So I'm calling in from the Chickasaw Nation in Oklahoma, but if you can see on the map, Chickasaw is actually located over here, more in the southeastern part of what's currently the United States. And this place is where Chickasha or Chickasaw language, my heritage language, came into existence. So I'm going to tell you the story of that, and feel free to keep sharing in the chat where you're calling in from. So for Chickasha or Chickasaw, the story of how our language came to be and the purpose it had is part of our migration story. A long time ago, our storytellers say that Chickasha and Chata or Choctaw people were one, speaking the same language and living somewhere in the West. And when it was time for my ancestors to go to their homelands, Abba Binitli, the one who sits above, called upon two brothers, Chickasaw and Chata, to lead the people in the direction of the rising sun. And each day, what they would do, and you can see in this picture, they placed a sacred pole called Iti Fabasa in the ground. And then whichever way the pole leaned was the direction that the people would walk. And so after they crossed the Mississippi River, they placed that pole in the ground once again. And this time there was a disagreement. So that's actually what you can see in the pictures. There's some disagreement between the two brothers about whether the pole is standing up straight or if it's still leaning. So Chata thought that the pole was still standing upright. And so he stayed with his people in that place, while Chickasaw led the people who would become Chickasha onto their homelands. And so in becoming a distinct people, Chickasha also received the gift of our language with which to speak to each other, the land, the plants, the animals, and the spirits. Wallapai educator Lucille Wadahamaji teaches that the gift of language must be cherished, nurtured, and treated with respect to honor the giver. And so this reverence of language was shared by Chickasha people as the language was passed orally from generation to generation. With colonization, the ability of Chickasha to freely nurture the gift of language became imperiled. And so our ancestral homeland spans what is currently Alabama, Arkansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Tennessee. And then beginning in 1837, the US military forcibly removed thousands of our people, including my great-great-great-grandparents, from those lands to Indian Territory, which is now what we call Oklahoma. That removal, along with a subsequent boarding school era, accelerated language shift from Chickasha to English dramatically among Chickasha and in my own family. And so my great-great-grandparents learned English, and they chose not to pass the language on to their children and grandchildren. These next generations face unrelenting pressure to assimilate and suppress their identity as Chickasha. And so many members of my grandparents' generation actually left Oklahoma in the 1950s in pursuit of economic opportunities. My grandfather ultimately settled his family in Southern California, and that's where my mother grew up, and that's also where I grew up. And living out in California, neither of us heard the language spoken at all. I was the first person in my family to begin reclaiming Chickasha, and a large motivator for me was to do that for the next generations in my family and also in our community more broadly. And so as an adult, I moved back to the Chickasaw Nation to be closer to the language and the community. And when my daughter was born here, the very first language that she heard was Chickasha. And you can see this picture. She's now 4, so she's not a baby anymore. But she has continued to speak Chickasha as a first language. And this is something that has not happened in my family for over 100 years. Or in the community since the 1940s. So we're in the Chickasaw Nation is in a period of transition where we're really starting to see the work of language revitalization sort of pay off in this emerging new generation of speakers. My own interest in Chickasha developed alongside a broader commitment to language reclamation that was made by the Chickasaw community. I began learning in 2008, 1 year after the Chickasaw Nation established the Chickasaw Language Revitalization Program, which has now sort of evolved into the Language Preservation Division. Currently, there are over 75,000 Chickasaw citizens, and fewer than 50 of them speak Chickasha as a first language. And most of these speakers are of the great-grandparental generation, so they're our elders. Our language learners are spread all over the world due to multiple layers of removal. So Chickasha people, 28% of them live within the boundaries of the Chickasaw Nation, 31% live in Oklahoma outside of the nation, and 41% live elsewhere. So the majority of our people do not live in the Chickasaw Nation. The work of the Language Preservation Division is specific to that context. Key initiatives include seeking guidance from a language committee that's comprised of our elder first language speakers, running the Chickasha Academy Adult Immersion Program to emerge new adult speakers of the language, supporting language classes in community schools and also online settings, publishing language books and resources through the Chickasaw Press, which is our tribal press, and also developing language education technologies. And so that's sort of my focus for today, is on that piece. For over 10 years, the Chickasaw Nation has used technology to support Chickasha. Many of these resources are free and publicly available, so I invite you to access them if that's of interest to you. One of the very first projects was the creation of the Inompa language app, and that was in 2009. And it's still available. You can still access it. It's on Android, Apple, and you can also just find it on the web. And you can get it just by searching for Inompa. The website chickasaw.tv has a language channel featuring profiles of speakers and content in the language, including all of the Chickasaw Rosetta Stone videos, which is something that we'll talk about later. Recently, a web version of the first Chickasaw dictionary was launched at achickasawdictionary.com. And this one is really neat because it's searchable and it includes all of the audio recordings for the entries. So this dictionary was made, I think it was in the early 70s by some of our elders who they kind of looked around and said, people aren't speaking the language as much anymore and we want to document it. And so they just sat at their kitchen table and they had a recorder. And so the audio that you can find on this dictionary that's now available to everyone is the recording of Mrs. Humes, who was a primary author of the dictionary, just saying the words. That's really neat. The nation also released Chickasha emojis, including language emojis. So you can see these in the picture, on the slide. So for example, instead of LOL, Chickasha text OLL, meaning Ola Lili, which means I'm laughing. So now there's an emoji for that. But the most comprehensive project to date is Rosetta Stone Chickasaw, and I'm part of the development team for this course. Rosetta Stone Chickasaw is a collaborative project between the Chickasaw Nation and Rosetta Stone that began in 2015. The course is free for all citizens and available for purchase by the public. So if you are interested in checking out Chickasaw Rosetta Stone and you're not a Chickasaw citizen, you are welcome to access it by purchasing a license. I've worked with Lakosh, who's the executive director for the Language Preservation Division, as well as staff linguist, Dr. Juliette Morgan, and our committee of elder speaker advisors to develop the 4 levels. And each level consists of 40 one-hour lessons. And each lesson features an immersive video in the language, vocabulary flashcards, a supplemental video, grammatical instruction, assessments, and then an optional reading and writing practice. The project proved much more work than we initially realized. So if you notice, I said we started in 2015. I think we envisioned this as a 4-year project where we finished each level in a year. But now we're probably looking at being 10 years into this before it's finished. So it's been a lot of work, a labor of love for sure. And one of the issues that we found early on was that the resources offered by Rosetta Stone were mostly for teaching skills related to business and tourism and in commonly spoken languages like Spanish or French. So these resources did not apply to the Chickasaw or language reclamation context. And so we had to create our own curriculum. Instead of teaching things like how to navigate an airport or how to order food at a restaurant, we work to center family relationships, connection to place, and cultural knowledge. The lessons are built around one multi-generational Chickasaw family. You can see them in the picture on the slide. They live in the Chickasaw Nation and they participate in community activities. Rosetta Stone Chickasaw has over 8,000 users and is also being used in 4-credit Oklahoma public high school world language classes. The efforts by the Language Preservation Division, including Rosetta Stone Chickasaw, have led to an increase in the number of Chickasha engaging in language revitalization. So in 2015, when we started this project, about 3% of Chickasaw citizens were involved in some form of language learning, whether it was classes, camps, clubs, something else. But now that number has increased to about 10% who are learning, and it's probably more now. But roughly a dozen of these learners are emerging as new, highly proficient speakers of the language. So the experience of working on Rosetta Stone Chickasaw compelled me to better understand how other Indigenous nations, communities, and organizations were using technology to support language reclamation in ways that aligned with cultural values. So for the research that I'm going to discuss in the next part of this presentation was done by me along with a small team of graduate students. And so we use decolonizing and relational methodology to accomplish 3 research goals. Number 1, to document existing online Indigenous language courses. Number 2, analyze these courses for examples of centering relationality. And 3, co-create knowledge with Indigenous language course creators. And so the research included a review of Indigenous language courses, interviews with course creators, and a virtual gathering for those using technology to support language revitalization. And importantly, our research was not about evaluating the courses or platforms in terms of their effectiveness or style. Rather, what we wanted to do was prioritize examples of how the course creators, so people working on the community side, were using the course features to express relational epistemologies. And so this guidebook is the outcome of our research, and it is free and available to the public. So I invite you to read it and use it and share it widely. The guide can be viewed online. So if you have your QR code scanner, you can get the digital version. And you can also download the PDF, which you could use offline, I mean. And so the other QR code goes to that. If you do not have your phone ready, these links are also available through the conference portal. I shared them in advance, so you should be able to find them via the conference portal. And so all the examples that I'm going to talk about today are in the guide plus more. So if you're interested in what I'm talking about and you want to learn more, definitely check out this guidebook. So again, through our research, we documented over 100 online Indigenous language courses across platforms like these. Most of the courses are free and available to the public. I'm sorry, they're available to the public. They're not all free. So a lot of them are free and others are available either with a subscription or a license. And so if you're interested in browsing this interactive map, you can follow the link via the QR code, or again, you should be able to access it through the conference portal. So of the platforms that we looked at, we saw that they offered these key features. So we said that the features are video, images, audio, text-based instruction, and assessment, all to support language learning and teaching. So you can see that not every platform offered all of those options. But the reason that we wanted to look at features was because we wanted the outcome of the research to be useful to Indigenous peoples creating online courses, regardless of the platform that they were using. And we also wanted to share ideas about creating video, images, audio, et cetera, with communities that might not be engaged in these that might be engaged in documentation activities, but not necessarily creating a full online course. So that way, if you're just interested in ideas about creating video, but you don't want to make a full online course, we hope that this information is still useful to you. So that said, my message for today is definitely not that every nation and community needs to have an online course. That's up to each community if that's something that's useful or not. My message for today is that we can learn from the course creators who have thought deeply and intentionally about how to use technology to learn and teach Indigenous languages. And so I'll share examples from courses as well as some ideas for educators. And since there are many different education contexts represented at this meeting, I encourage you to think creatively about the possibilities that work for you and your context. So now we'll look at some examples. All right, so audio. The creation of audio content is a major part of the work to create an online course. From online courses, we learn that recordings of individual vocabulary words are important, but also critical are recordings of the words used in complete sentences and in a variety of culturally relevant contexts. For example, in Chickasaw Rosetta Stone, the word for brother, inakfi, is introduced as a vocabulary word in a lesson focused on kinship terms. And now, whether in person or online, what I like to do is use recordings like this for pronunciation practice. So as a learner / teacher, there are times when my pronunciation may be a bit off. And so the recording invites a first language speaker into our learning space to help us. And in this case, the recording is extra special because the speaker here, Stanley Smith, has now passed on. And through the recording, learners are still able to have a connection to this cherished language speaker who wanted their audio to be used in this way. So one way that I would use this if we were in an online, like Zoom-based live language class, is to play the audio and have you all repeat. So let's go ahead and try that. So I will play this, and after you hear it, go ahead and try saying it. Oops.
Inakfi.
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 Inakfi. So using the audio clip on Zoom can sometimes help learners have less anxiety about speaking in front of others because we didn't actually hear you all say the word out loud, but you're still getting the practice. However, learning to say a word in isolation is just the first step on a language learning journey. So in other parts of this lesson, the terms used in complete sentences like
Yapat Anakfi.
Yapat Anakfi, this is my brother. The lesson teaches learners about how noun affixes are used to express relationships and how different types of relationships are understood through the clan system. Notably, some courses enacted relational epistemologies by teaching learners how to interact with other than human relations, such as land, water, plants, animals, and other beings, or by showing how other than human beings interact with each other in the language. So in a later Chickasaw Rosetta Stone lesson, the term inakfi is revisited to tell a shakunapa, or traditional story, about why turkey chest feathers look the way they do.
Nitakupake ma luksi mecha inakfiat uwatatuk.
So Turkey interacts with Turtle and his brothers after finding a lock of Chickasha hair, which becomes the turkey's chest feather. So you can see in the picture on the slide that the turkey's kind of wearing the hair that they found as a necklace, and that ultimately becomes that, I'm not sure what it's called in English, but the chest feathers that you see. In the Shokonopa, learners see examples of Turkey and the turtle speaking Chickasha to each other, which is reflective of a time when many beings spoke the language to each other. Modeling conversations is a way to show variation and teach things like how to ask and answer questions, take turns talking, express interest in or disagreement with what someone's saying, joke or tease, which is an important one, and more. These skills help learners to build and strengthen relationships to other people. The Cherokee Mango Languages course includes audio conversations between Cherokee National Treasures and first language speakers John Ross and Anna Sixkiller. And the audio recordings of conversations help prepare learners to use what they're learning in their communities and with other people. Course creators also considered ways of using examples of both scripted and unscripted or natural conversations, spontaneous conversations between speakers so that learners could hear the many ways that people express themselves through the language. Several courses demonstrated efforts to include audio from many speakers, including those of different ages, proficiencies, and from different regions. Because first language speakers are often elders, this approach helps to address language ideologies about speakerhood and age, including younger speakers of varying proficiencies normalizes the everyday use of language among younger generations. So it helps to address sometimes when people are like, that's not how you say that. By having learners represented in audio recordings, that can kind of help show that there's many different ways to say something. So some courses also supported teaching language across regions and dialects, and therefore included speakers of multiple varieties of the language. The Kwakwaka'wakw 7,000 Languages course had speakers from different Kwakwaka'wakw communities. And as stated in the course description, the slide on the right, this approach values dialectical difference to affirm identity. And it's always important to share information about the speakers whose voices are heard. So sometimes if you just hear the audio, it's sort of like a disembodied voice, and it's hard to make a connection to that voice if you don't know who the person is. And unfortunately, in our review, we found that many of the courses included audio of unidentified speakers. And a major reason for this was because the platforms, which were operating from a more Western perspective, just didn't have designated spots in the courses to credit contributors. So some course creators worked around this by repurposing other types of course features, like a text-based activity, to share credits or speaker biographies. And this is a slide from the Michif 7,000 Languages course, where the course creators decided to include biographies and photographs of everyone who contributed to the course. So in a language education setting, whether you're online or in person, there are opportunities for teachers to build lessons and activities around audio recordings and for the students to engage. So for example, students might listen to an audio recording of a story, write a biography of the speaker who told the story, and then maybe create their own recording to retell the story in their own words. This allows teachers and students to engage with the language while learning practical skills to contribute to language documentation, revitalization, and reclamation. And this is so important because when we build capacity to do this kind of work in our own communities, we don't have to rely on outside companies and technology providers if we don't want to do that. So another feature was images. Communities use photographs, artwork, and other graphics in their courses to build relationships with learners and help learners create connection to the language that they're learning. So one common way to include images was through photographs. And on the platforms that supported photographs, course creators use a mix of stock and custom photography. So stock meaning like going on Getty Images and finding things from that, like a database like that. An issue is there's not a lot of Indigenous representation on those types of stock photo databases. So custom photographs were usually created by the community specifically for their course, and they often related to things like ancestral foods, cultural items and practices, and also specific places that were significant to the community. Some platforms like Duolingo, Kadu, and Drops didn't support photographs, but used branded art for images instead. And what we saw is that it can be very difficult to enact relationality when using graphics that are very generic. If you've used Duolingo, you might recall there's like a different characters, like a bear, the owl, which might not be culturally appropriate for some folks, and things like that. So wanting to include more relevant imagery, the Duolingo Olelo Hawaii team collaborated with a local artist to create images that use Duolingo's color palette and art style. And the resulting images enact relationality by giving Olelo Hawaii learners a visual representation of familiar foods. Course creators made decisions together about which plant relations were important to include and how they would be represented. So you can see these pictures here, they kind of look like what you might see in Duolingo, but these were made specifically by the community. All right, and the last type of images that we saw in courses were custom artwork. Usually the custom artwork was created by community members to express concepts that the photographs or other graphics just couldn't. Communities used existing artwork, or they collaborated with artists to bring their visions to life in ways that reflected the community's values and traditions. So for example, in Chickasaw Rosetta Stone, there was no photograph of a turtle's broken shell being sewn together by the gnats. And then in the Rosetta Stone Ojibwe course, they needed an image to represent the vocabulary word for spirit. So again, thinking about applications in educational context, there's great opportunity to invite students into this work by having them create visual representations of the language through photography, graphic design, and drawing or traditional mediums. So teachers could design lessons about digital photography, the use of graphic design software, or digitizing art created through traditional mediums. And the way that we represent ourselves and our world from our own perspective is about our sovereignty. So for example, when we were selecting vocabulary images for Rosetta Stone Chickasaw, the Rosetta Stone team chose a picture of an elephant for our word, ishto, which means big. And you can absolutely describe an elephant as ishto, but we didn't have elephants in our homelands, obviously, so this probably wasn't how our ancestors would have thought of the word. So the process of thinking about words from our ancestors' perspectives creates an intimacy with our language that's important for language reclamation. Okay, videos. So actually most platforms did not include videos. The only one that did was Rosetta Stone. The Chickasaw and Ojibwe courses relied heavily on videos as sort of central to the lessons, and then built content around them. So in both cases, the lesson begins with a scripted and professionally produced immersive short video that introduces the theme along with key vocabulary and grammar concepts. And just like the Rosetta Stone Chickasaw videos, the Ojibwe videos also revolved around an intergenerational family that was doing activities together in their nation. As with audio, videos are especially helpful learning tools when they share complete sentences and conversations in culturally relevant contexts. So in both courses, videos highlight cultural significant activities like gathering and preparing traditional foods, hunting, community feasts or meals, kinship relationships, regalia, and prayers. For example, in Chickasaw Rosetta Stone, a series of videos follow the family through the process of gathering, cleaning, cooking, and eating a tonfula emihla, or wild onions. And similarly, in Ojibwe Rosetta Stone video shows the family gathering, preparing wild rice by knocking it into their canoe, parching it over a fire, threshing it by stepping on it, and then winnowing it to remove the holes. And these videos emphasize relationships between people, land, food, water, and spirits. So I wanted to share one of the videos. So I'm gonna stop sharing for a moment and switch screens.
Nanda iskatimi.
Atufla misa chupalele.
Chikma atomfala emithla ayok panchli.
Tumpali istayag ma atufla misa huspod istaya. Atufla misa himita ilaywa. Atufla misa sipugnet kaluchume. Yamat apa ipugbano. Hasuk oba chume. Iskuli makila. Ischa, escuché, lukfi bika, Lukfit Wilila Chi. Isbasli Makilla. Isa Chifa Makilla. Hatko Chifa.
Apa amaltaha?
Timbang may supuni Makilla. Chimas kanian na.
All right, there we go. So importantly, the professionally produced videos, I think are really neat, but videos do not need to be professionally produced to be useful for language learning. So for example, an Ojibwe language documentation project by Mary Hermes and colleagues used those GoPro cameras to film intergenerational forest walks with youth and elders to connect people to place to language. And so in this way, the process of creating videos is a language learning tool, and also the videos themselves are language learning tools. So text-based instruction refers to the use of text in English or another language that the learner already knows to explain grammar and or cultural concepts. So many Indigenous languages have complex grammatical structures that can be challenging to teach, especially at more advanced levels. Grammatical explanations can help teach polysynthetic languages in which the words are composed of morphemes. Teaching morphemes and offering direct grammatical instruction allows for deeper engagement with cultural concepts and an appreciation for the beauty of Indigenous languages. Indigenous language courses prioritize practical and culturally relevant examples. The Potawatomi Mango language course teaches language about clan relationships using color coding. And this color coding helps learners to understand how Potawatomi morphemes correlate to the English words. And then this card was complemented by an explanation that clans are beings to which Potawatomi people are related. In addition to sharing information about grammar usage, several courses also included cultural information and teachings as written text. The Ojibwe Rosetta Stone course creators integrated cultural practice throughout all lessons and used shorter modules to provide additional information about the culture in English. So this image on the left, I know it's small, but it shows an example of sharing cultural protocols surrounding tobacco. And then additional teachings related to the tobacco were discussed in other parts of the lesson and course. And course creators worked with elders to determine what cultural knowledge to share or omit. And so while online courses can be powerful tools for sharing knowledge, Indigenous peoples must decide what's appropriate to share in this format and what's not. While we strive for oral immersion as an effective way to teach language, research shows that direct grammatical instruction can also be helpful for additional language learners. And what we learned from these examples, and also from the Rossborough et al. Article that I quoted a couple slides ago, is that it's important to teach grammar in ways that are reflective of cultural values. The creativity of Indigenous language course creators is inspiring, but it also speaks to a greater need for technologies created for language revitalization in collaboration with and under the leadership of Indigenous peoples. So if you're interested in learning more directly from Indigenous language course creators, I invite you to watch the Learning in Relation webinar recording. So the link is at the bottom of the slide, and it's also one that I shared through the conference portal. To conclude, I will share 3 key themes emerging from this project that I think have relevance to us all. So first, Indigenous language course creators are engaged in decolonizing praxis as they navigate tensions between Western and Indigenous approaches to learning and teaching language and education more broadly. Indigenous language courses and initiatives have a purpose within a long-term vision for language reclamation. Course creators shared that their focus was not simply on creating a course, but rather designing a course that would support existing and future language reclamation efforts. These efforts often focus on restoring intergenerational language sharing and bringing the language back into home and community. Heather Suter, who worked on the Michif 7,000 language course, explained that it's not the course that saves a language, it's the community. It's the people coming together and using the language. In the case of the Dene Bazad or Navajo Duolingo course, there was a partnership with San Juan High School. And the high school students helped create the course as part of their language class. So we interviewed one of the students who shared about how the class helped create content for the course by basically planning in class. And then what they would do is they would go home and they would get input from their families and their elders, and then they would bring that back to class. And so this is an example of decolonizing praxis and centering relationality through intergenerational knowledge sharing that's led by the youth. Second, course creators affirm that building, strengthening, and sustaining relationships is critical. Relationality was a foundational principle that not only affected how the course was completed on a logistical level, but was also central to the course design itself. The courses were made to help learners function within the context of their communities, so many included a focus on practical communication and relationships. Sarah Child, who worked on the Kwakwala 7,000 language course, emphasized being in good relationship requires language learners to take active rather than passive roles in language reclamation. She stated, "We wanted to create a course that was going to help people get to the doing part." Course creators had a strong desire to use the courses to build a sense of community around the language for learners, as well as to inspire future learners to become involved in language reclamation. Their goal for creating the course was to reach people who would otherwise not have the language and to connect them to the community. They felt that these efforts to include everyone were essential to the continuance of the language. And as one Osage Nation language teacher expressed, sharing language via technology is an invitation for people to come home. People coming home and using the language together is a vision of sovereignty. Third, the process of creating a course was as, if not more important than the course itself. Course creators agreed that there was great value in Indigenous communities coming together to do a language project. Building an online course prompts continual conversation among community language advocates about how to overcome challenges, create meaningful pedagogical materials, and bring the community around toward common goals. The director of the Comanche language program shared, "The way that I think about community and culture in our materials is that the end product is not what we're working on. We're building together. We're building this together. And that's the Comanche way, that we build things together. We spend time together, and then that's almost more important than the end result, the process of making it and building it." Whether you're teaching language online or in person, whether you're running an immersion program or just incorporating language as one piece of a broader program, I hope that you're inspired by these examples and have new ideas about how to use technology in ways aligned with cultural values to support Indigenous education and reclamation. Yakoke Hachimenili. And now we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Well, and one question that someone submitted just a little bit ago was, is there an online course for Tlingit language?
Oh, that's a good question. I would suggest to go to that map that I talked about. And then when you get to that map, it's interactive. So you should be able to type the language name in and see if a course comes up for that language. But I don't remember off the top of my head if there is one. I hadn't had a chance to look at the chat, so it's really great to see people calling in from all over. Are there any other questions? You can use the chat or also the Q&A feature that you should see at the bottom of your page. Yeah, okay, it's good to also see some familiar faces logged on here. Okay. Okay, I see a question. I see one in the chat. Do they have an interactive dictionary? Could you share a little bit more for a specific community?
I know Ryan's in Ho Chunk Nation, so I don't know if he's asking about with Chickasaw or with Ho Chunk.
There's definitely a lot of technologies out there to create different types of dictionaries. A lot of communities create talking dictionaries and things like that. Our project didn't look specifically at dictionaries. We were looking, we were focused on courses, especially those that had like a sequence curriculum as part of the work. Okay, is there data on language retention using technology? That's a really good question. There are some different studies out there, but unfortunately what we found in the different literature reviews and things that we did for this project is that there actually is not a lot that's specific to Indigenous languages. So there might be information that's for commonly taught languages like Spanish, but then it's hard to know how that would apply to an Indigenous context. What I would say, just having done this sort of survey of the courses and talking with people, is that the most common use for these language courses is to bring beginners up to a level of proficiency so that they can then engage with in-person speakers. So for example, some communities might use an online course as sort of a prerequisite to joining a mentor or master apprentice program. And then the thought behind that is that these courses can do a lot. It's hard to teach really advanced languages, like language information through them, but they can do a lot towards getting a beginner, teaching them the basics. So if you have someone go through and learn the basics, then the idea is that when they do go to work with speakers who might be, there may be limited resources and sort of time and availability of speakers, that then your speakers don't have to spend a lot of time bringing brand new language learners up to speed and can therefore support that more advanced language instruction. Okay, we have someone from San Juan. Yeah. Yeah, the link should be available. If you're having trouble finding them, you feel free to email me and I can also send them. Yeah, definitely a lot of work has gone into these courses. I think one thing that we found is that a lot of the courses tend to be shorter, but there are some communities, especially on the Rosetta Stone courses, that are really like trying to use these courses to teach advanced language. And that's one reason that our project has taken so long, is because we've gotten to a point in our language teaching where we're trying to teach things that haven't been well documented. So there's not already existing resources where we can just draw on that. We're having to do work with speakers in order to figure out, well, how does this word really work? Or how does this affix really work? And so that makes that kind of slows down the project, because there's a language documentation aspect to it. Is getting the emojis, is that just a downloadable app? Yep. If you want to get those Chickasaw emojis, you can download the app. I think the app is just called Chikusha Emojis, and then you would use it. I think you can switch, almost like switching to a different keyboard, and then you can send those emojis. Okay, what funding was used for Rosetta Stone? We've been in discussion with them, but the cost was so expensive. Yes, so that's a major issue is funding. So for Chickasaw Nation, we've been very fortunate that the tribe has wanted to invest in this. And a major reason for that is what I talked about is so many people don't live in Chickasaw Nation that we needed something like this in order to reach folks. But it is a very expensive endeavor. And so if you're interested in creating an online course and want to work with a technology provider that has experience working with Indigenous communities and does not charge for their service, I would recommend 7,000 Languages. And 7,000 Languages is a nonprofit, and they are really working on meeting this need. So they have that you used to have to sign up for a wait list, but my understanding is that's not the case anymore. They've been looking into ways that lots of different people can be working on courses at the same time. The one thing I'll say about the cost of a course like Rosetta Stone is that if you need support like IT support and things like that, you don't want to mess with the technology side. That is one of the major reasons why these technology providers cost so much, is because you're basically paying for a team that's responsible for building on the back end and just making sure that if anything goes wrong, they take care of it and you don't have to worry about it. So if you have an IT team on your side and can sort of take on some of that responsibility around technology, a course like 7,000 Languages might be a better fit for you. All right, any other questions? Have you looked into a way to collaborate with a high school to provide a CTE pathway for an Indigenous language pathway? Actually, I'm not sure what that stands for.
It's a career technology education.
Okay. I'm not familiar with that pathway. What could you share what it entails? And maybe I can.
So I'm guessing Brandon is still typing. Typically in the CTE world, it's connecting students with career pathways. So I think he's looking at it from maybe a perspective of, being able to do community work or being an educator within the Indigenous language realm.
Yeah, I don't feel totally able to speak to the details of your question, but I will say that in terms of working with public schools, there are challenges, for example, to getting teachers certified and things like that. Some states are more open, some states are more restrictive. Some are restrictive, but there's a supportive person that kind of helps open up those pathways. And so I think what we've seen is that having partnerships with specific schools opens a lot of doors in terms of creative thinking around ways to meet those types of needs. So for example, right now, our language teachers that are in the public high schools teaching accredited language classes actually work for the nation and go into the school rather than being teachers. So I think that there's creative ways when you have that partnership in place to think about strategies. Let's see, do you use assessments? I cut out the assessment portion of this presentation so that it wouldn't be too long, but I would recommend to look at the guidebook because there is a section that's all about assessment. But I think we're about out of time, so I won't get into the nitty-gritty of the assessment, but the answer is yes. All right, well, thank you so much. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share this work with you, and I hope that you find it useful. Download the guide, share it. Yeah, koke hachimenili.
Thank you. So for all of you who are trying to find the slides and the links, if you go to the agenda tab in the platform and go to today, just scroll down to this session, and right underneath where you see Carrie's name, you'll see where you can download and be able to get everything right there. And it should download immediately for you, but if not, let us know. We can help you get that downloaded. But thank you again, Carrie, for spending time with us today and a wonderful keynote. And for those of you joining us, thank you for joining day 3. And you have about 10 minutes until your first breakout sessions of the day begin.